Okay, and that is on. Okay, are you ready?
I am ready.
Right, 3, 2, 1. It has been one of the most dramatic weeks in the world of athletics and perhaps in the world of sport. There have been accusations of racism and human rights groups have got involved, but in amongst it all, a 28-year-old double Olympic and 3-time world champion may never be able to run competitively again. Welcome to the Science and Sport podcast with myself, Mike Finch, and Professor Ross Tucker. So this week, the Court of Arbitration for Sport was against Caster Semenya in a case against the International Association of Athletics Federations. And there's been a lot of talk this week about this very dramatic case. Lots of drama, lots of emotion, lots of reaction to it, not only in South Africa but around the world. And it means effectively that Caster Semenya's future in the sport, while being doubt, we may never see her race on the track again. Ross Tucker, your reaction?
Well, to the verdict, I was disappointed and stunned, to be honest. I suppose in hindsight, now that it's been a couple of days, and by we, just for disclosure, I was part of the team that testified at that court case in support of Caster Semenya's case. I think we convinced ourselves so much of the merits of our case that we fully expected to win. Maybe guilty a little bit of confirmation bias. We'd immersed ourselves for 5 or 6 months in the arguments that we were going to present, and we were really sure that they were strong. You know, we went there to present a case for why the evidence supporting the guideline was inadequate, poor quality, failed to do the job that it would have needed to do. And I was really confident we'd win. So for the last 2 months, I've been thinking ahead to this podcast and how I was going to explain the decision and so forth. And then by Tuesday night, I was like, oh man, I got to rethink all of this. How did we lose? So disappointed, surprised, and then disappointed for her and for all the other athletes who will now be affected by this, because there are more than just her, and I don't know where this goes next.
So just to kind of explain the decision, the courts ruled that Caster Semenya's case against the IAAF means that she now has to take medication to reduce her levels of testosterone. I mean, if you've been living in La La Land or had your head stuck in the sand the last couple of days, you probably wouldn't have heard about this, but it has been in South African newspapers on the front page. We've seen interviews that Ross has done across many of the international networks, TV networks. It's a global story, but essentially means that she has to take the medication, and there are lots of issues around that, which we'll get into a little bit later. But she has now lost the case, which means she either has to take the medication so she compete in her favourite events, or she can compete in events that are not covered in this ruling, which are not her specialty events. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, pretty much. She's got 2 legal options and 3 performance options. The legal options are binary. She challenges it or she accepts it. If she challenges it, then she leaves the sports legal system and she has to go to a choice of the Swiss Federal Tribunal, potentially European Human Rights Court. I'm not sure. That's a legal aspect I won't pretend to know much about.
We're just sports scientists on this podcast.
Yeah. I feel like a TV lawyer having sat through this and read so much, but I'm not going to give you second-hand information, rather. The performance side, I'll say a little more clearly. She's got 3 options. One is she can stay where she is, 800, 1500. But in order to do that, she has to take the medication or have surgery in order to be eligible according to the policy that is now finalized.
Yeah.
And there's no subsequent challenge to that within this court, by the way. The second option she has is she can run distances not covered by the regulation. So that means she could go down to 200, or she could go up to 3,000 and 5,000. And then the third option is that she can just say, you know what, I've had 10 years of this, I'm done, I'm out, I'm walking away, thanks for the memories and the problems, and then retire. So she's got those 3 options. I don't know what she's going to do. I've seen people suggest both extremes, retirement versus challenge. I don't know her mind. That's the next installment.
So the last couple of days, you've probably done more interviews around this case than you've probably ever done in your life. You've been on the phone virtually every single day from early in the morning. What has the reaction been, not only here in South Africa, but globally to the story?
Well, in South Africa, it's obviously coloured enormously by patriotic bias, quote unquote, and support. I mean, bias isn't always bad. I think it's a lot of people supporting her case. I don't think they always know why why they're supporting a case other than to support, which is fine. Globally, I think most people were surprised.
Yeah.
You know, what was it, 4 years ago now, 2015, a similar court case was heard by the same court, and the decision in that instance, and I suppose in order to understand this, we will have to get into that, was that there was insufficient evidence and they were going to set it aside. And it seemed to me that the prevailing wind direction socially, societally, is for more inclusion and to not discriminate. And so when Cass said this is discriminatory, but that it's reasonable, that it's justified and it's proportionate, that was a surprise, because I figured that the inertia of the system seemed to be going that way, and all of a sudden we've gone this way on this. So I think the rest of the world is surprised, trying to understand it, because certainly the decision we saw had certain schizophrenic properties.
Yeah.
So I think there's confusion, and there's surprise, and then there's, of course, there are some people who are saying, good on the IAAF, well done, you stood up for women's sports, and this is the right decision to have reached.
I mean, it's amazing just here in South Africa, and obviously we're a country with a very tarnished history in many ways, so it has become a political issue. And some of the quotes that we've seen from the local political organisations calling ANC calling it appalling, for probably reasons that they don't really understand scientifically, but from a human rights perspective they see that. We've seen trade unions going out on a limb and talking about it. So anybody who's got an opinion has said something about this case, and often misinformed about the case, although we have seen a lot of the journalists that have interviewed and the radio talk show hosts have interviewed you have really done their research, because there is a huge amount of interest in this.
I've been actually pleasantly surprised by the quality of the questions that some of the media are asking. I think they've had, in fairness, 10 years of exposure to the Caster Semenya controversy, so people have learned. 10 years ago, people were incredulous that this was even a question. How is there possibly confusion between a man and a woman? I think now people are a lot wiser and a lot more informed about the complexities of biological sex. So the questions have been good. It's the spokespeople and the campaigners and the crusaders that are, in my opinion, doing it a disservice. And I can't stress enough how much I distance myself from the politics of this discussion.
Yeah.
I mean, I was on an interview yesterday with a South African delegate to one of the UN groups, and she was adamant that this was racism, she was adamant that this was sexism, and so forth. And I don't think that conceptually it is. I disagree with much of the IAAF's position. I strongly disagree with the evidence that they're using to support their position, but I can't bring myself to disagree with the concept of what they're trying to do, the principle and the theory behind what they're trying to do, and to call it racism to me shuts the conversation down. You know what the problem there is, that when your first reaction is a knee-jerk or a shoot from the hip because you're fired up and emotional and you blame racism, then you pretty much go down a cul-de-sac and you can't engage with the detail in a constructive way. So I suppose our job for the next 45 minutes to an hour is to try and move that stuff aside and actually talk about the substance, so that we can be constructive about pros and cons.
Well, let's talk about the substance. The things that you talked about often in your writings leading up to this decision is the idea of concept versus evidence. Concept being that in terms of the IAAF, they're trying to protect the integrity of female sport, particularly in athletics. And let's not forget that this decision is probably going to move towards the IOC will probably adopt a similar policy. It could affect women's sport, not just in athletics. And the evidence is obviously the scientific evidence that your team brought and Caster Semenya's team brought to that Court of Arbitration. But can you just explain that concept versus evidence then? Because it is quite complex, but if you don't understand it, you probably don't understand the debate.
Yeah, you can't understand the decision, because my simple read of the decision is that Cass has weighed the concept more heavily than the evidence. In other words, they've got these two conflicting issues, and they've said which one matters more, theory, evidence. They've gone theory. That's how they made the decision. It's the only way you can explain it. So 4 or 5 years ago, there was no evidence, because no studies had ever been done in this population, DSDs, to try and understand performance advantages that might be unfair. So all you had was two sides that were arguing over theories. Now the IAAF theory was, and I'll try and summarize this point by point, is number one, men and women compete separately for a very good biological reason. The main factor causing the biological difference between men and women is testosterone, because of what it does to the body after adolescence. Therefore, if women have elevated levels of testosterone by virtue of one of a few conditions collectively resulting in what are called DSDs, differences of sex development, those women have an unfair advantage and should be compelled to lower their testosterone. The rest of the world was saying, well, so what? Natural advantage is natural advantage, leave it alone, it's discriminatory and so forth. And the two sides were basically arguing back and forth.
Yeah.
And in 2015, CAS changed the debate. They put there what to me anyway personally is a watershed, because they said, it's fine, it's all good and well, you say X, you say Y, someone bring the evidence. And that leads us to this court case. So this court case becomes an argument about whether there is evidence to support the theory. So the IAAF have held fast to their theory, Semenya has held fast to hers, and the IAAF are obliged to provide enough evidence to support their position. And that is basically what the week in Lausanne was dedicated towards doing.
But just taking a step back, so when the IAAF brought this evidence, they brought it in late 2018, and that's when this court case kind of started, the whole process of this. I mean, let's just take a little, almost back to the start of this. In 2009, when Caster Semenya first arrived on the scene, she was winning the African Championship, went on to win the World Championships. She went through a tough time in the mid-2000s because of changes to her body, because she was forced to take this medication. She challenged it. Lots of things have happened since. But now we're at a point where it was that decision that kind of said, if you're above 5 nanomoles per litre, you're therefore illegal, you're not able to compete as a woman in female events.
Not all female events, right?
All female events.
For this latest policy. So this was the key difference. So the DSD regulation is not in its first iteration. This is its second or third version. So the first one came just after Semenya in 2009. That policy was basically moved aside by the court decision in 2015, in which they said, we agree with your concept, but now you must bring us evidence. And the words that Cass used are, the numbers matter. Literally, that's in that legal decision.
Yeah.
The numbers matter. The magnitude is important, right? So now the IAAF went off to collect their evidence, and over the course of from 2014 up to 2017, there are scientific papers that show you what this evidence is. The end result of that evidence is that the new policy comes out in April 2018. It no longer covers all female events. It only covers 400 hurdles, 800, and the 1500 mile combination. So when people saw that, they said, whoa, hang on. This is clearly an anti-Caster Semenya policy.
Yeah.
And that attitude, I've seen that a lot in the last few days, is that it's because of that selection of events, it must be targeted at Semenya.
So just to support your argument, even Caster herself has tweeted over this controversy. I think in fact she's tweeted this yesterday. I know that the IAAF's regulations have always targeted me specifically. For a decade, the IAAF has tried to slow me down. This has actually made me stronger. The decision of the CAS will not hold me back. I will once again rise above and continue to inspire young women and athletes in South Africa and around the world. So even Caster, who is obviously very involved in this case, has taken it quite personally, because it's not a leap of faith to suggest that this is aimed at her to some extent.
Yeah, I can understand that. I mean,
Yeah.
Would you
Absolutely.
take it?
It's hard not to take it personally if you were involved. Yeah.
I mean, for her, it is personal. It's not in her interest to worry about the 5 or 6 other people. She's the one who has to take the medicine. She's the one who has to change her career plans. So of course it's personal. I don't think that it's targeted.
It's personal, but it's not personal.
Yeah.
It's a broader thing, yeah.
So the way that it's played out, it affects her most publicly. But I don't think that it's targeted at her. It's not like a group of people have sat down and said, right, these are the events she runs, these are the events we'll regulate. And what I would be at pains to explain is that the reason the policy only covers those events is because when the IAAF was mandated to go away and bring back research, they were effectively painted into a corner where their new policy had to be led by evidence. So when they did their study, 2011-2013 research study at their World Championships, The only events where they found an effect of testosterone were the 400 hurdles, and the 800 on the track. They also found hammer throw and pole vault, but they didn't have any women with these medical conditions in those events. So they said, well, that means it's a false positive, it's not a real finding. So we're going to discard the field events, and we're going to say 400 hurdles, 800. Because they couldn't add other events because they didn't have the evidence. They only had it for those events. Then they added the 1500. Now that looks, depending on your mood and your perspective, that looks malicious towards Semenya.
Absolutely.
The IAAF's argument is that so many athletes run both the 800 and the 15 that it would be absurd not to cover that set of events. So then they added the 1500 despite not having evidence. So
the Court of Arbitration for sport, in fact, make a recommendation to the IAAF not to include that mile 1500 meter event. We'll get it a bit later. We'll talk about the reaction of the IAAF and particularly Seb Coe to that.
Yeah.
But it was a point of contention even in the decision of CAS.
Yeah, so there's a suggestion by CAS that the IAAF considered taking the 1500 out because there was no evidence. But the point was, the IAAF took one step after the next, 1, 2, 3, and by the time they looked up, having been mandated to create an evidence-based policy, the foundation for this regulation had to be evidence. The only events for which they had evidence were the 4, 8, and 400 hurdles, plus, and we'll get to this, the 15. So that's why it's those events. It wasn't because they arbitrarily targeted Semenya, it's because that's where the evidence led them. The problem with that, and I think this is a significant problem, is that it creates a massive paradox for the model. Because the IAAF's model is that high testosterone, by virtue of having testes and being genetically male, gives you male-like advantages. Okay, that's fine when we compare men to women. It's true. Men are 10 to 12% faster than women from the 100 all the way to the marathon. Long jump, high jump. In other words, it doesn't matter whether your event lasts 2 seconds or 2 hours. Testosterone gives men such a large advantage that we have to separate them. But the key is testosterone does not discriminate. When the East German, Eastern Bloc, some American sprinters, athletes in the 1980s were doping using testosterone, they got better at every single event. Not just the 4 and the 8 and the 15. Testosterone does not discriminate. But now you've got a policy where your theory is that it does. Because how can it not cover all the events? So in my opinion, the IAAF's own evidence contradicts its own model. And therefore, it creates this untenable internal inconsistency that I think undermines its integrity. Because the absurd situation is that if there was a meeting over a weekend, Caster Semenya could run the 5,000 on a Friday, no problem. She could run the 200 on the Saturday, no problem. But to run an 800 or a 1500 on a Sunday, now she's not eligible. Why? Oh, because she's biologically getting the advantages of a man. But not in a 5, not in a 2. That's absurd. It's preposterous and wacky, and it completely undermines the theory.
So that's the one problem with the IAAF's argument. The second one, which you've written about extensively, is the fact that they're only using testosterone as the measure. In other words, if you have high testosterone levels, and you and I have the same high testosterone levels, we're going to be equally strong and athletic. But testosterone is not necessarily, it's how you use the testosterone that is the measure of how effective it is as a hormone.
Yeah, so testosterone is the leading man or the leading woman, maybe I shouldn't use these pronouns, the leading role player in this discussion. So the first question there you might ask is, how did we come to the point that testosterone is the target? If you go back decades, the issue of men versus women and gender verification was done by a simple physical exam. Women used to have to be physically examined by a panel of doctors who would then decide if you were female or male. Now, that you can imagine, I mean, that's extraordinary to think.
Talk about human rights issues.
That's within our parents' lifetimes. That's what was happening. Then for good reasons, they said, this is no good. And so they moved on to the next candidate, which was genetics. And they said, if you have a male chromosome set compared to a female, that's what we're going to do. So if you were XY, you were male. If you were XX, you were female. So that sounds great in theory because you can very easily split the world into males and females. The problem is that sometimes you get XY, male genetically, but they can't use...
Or male chromosomally.
Yes, so let's be precise. Chromosomally male, which means they have the gene, it's called the SRY gene, on that Y chromosome that's going to send the signals to become male.
Yeah.
So what happens next is you have the chromosome, the gene. You form the testes, you produce the testosterone. The testosterone does its business, which is to generate your male reproductive organs and later in life, what are called the male secondary sex characteristics. Deepening of the voice, hair growth, none of which is relevant to sport, but muscle mass, less fat mass, shape of the skeleton, strength of the skeleton, cardiovascular capacity, hemoglobin. Now, even a basic understanding of physiology tells you that that list of things makes a big difference to performance. So the point was it goes genetics, hormone, biology, performance.
Which is the IAAF argument.
Which is the IAAF argument. The problem in some people is that they meet the first step criteria, genetically, chromosomally male, but they can't use the hormone. So they've got all the testosterone in the world, but it has no benefit, and they develop as female. So that's why the genetics argument failed, was because there's a small group of people who meet the one criteria but not the other. And so they moved on, and they said, all right, let's look next at testosterone. So it's taken us a couple of minutes, but we've got now to the point of understanding why testosterone is the candidate here. So that what sports authorities now are saying is we're going to measure testosterone. Why? Because in theory, men have much higher levels of testosterone than women.
Yep.
In theory, testosterone is one of the primary determinants of the biology that makes men superior at sport compared to women, and therefore it's a good candidate. It's a surrogate marker of the biological sex that matters for performance.
And then just look at those numbers. So this 5 nanomoles per litre is the number that the IAAF have used. Previously it was 10 nanomoles per litre. Just give us an idea of where men and women sit on that nanomoles per litre.
Right, so in the absence of quote-unquote pathology, in other words, in normal, typical development and the situation, women lie between almost 0, so 0.7, and about 2.7 nanomoles, and the men's range runs from about 7.98 all the way up to the 30s. So the lower limit for men in a normal circumstance is higher than the upper limit for women. The IAAF's own research found that 99% of women lie under 3. So that fits more or less with that argument. And there are other studies where they reckon there's a 1 in 10,000 chance that you'll be above 5. And that's due to certain medical conditions, polycystic ovary syndrome and so forth. So they figured that the concentration of testosterone was a good marker. The theoretical problem, and you alluded to this 2 questions back, is that concentration alone isn't all that matters. 2 people can have the same levels and have vastly different effects of that level. So you can't judge based on that number only what the biology of the testosterone is, which is why you can look at that in the opposite direction. So you can say, okay, Usain Bolt compared to you or me, there's no guarantee his testosterone is higher than ours, even though in every respect of biology he's
physically superior
to us. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the analogy I heard the other day was it's about like having a tank of petrol. So we all have maybe 20 litres of petrol in our car, and one of us has a V8 engine, the other one has a sort of a 2 litre engine, and it's how you use the testosterone, how you use that fuel, and that's the difference. So is it fair to say that the IAAF have kind of ignored that argument, and that's the argument that Caster and your team brought to the table in this court case?
I don't know if they've ignored it so much as glossed over it accidentally, potentially. And there's an important concept here that I'd like to get into in a moment. Our argument was, yes, very much that testosterone alone doesn't do the job. And again, you can find cases of people who have incredibly high testosterone levels, but who derive no benefit from it because they are insensitive. And so when we talk about these DSDs, important point is that a DSD is kind of a catch-all phrase to describe what is basically the outcome.
Yeah.
But the cause is any number of medical conditions. And one of those conditions is called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So an androgen is a male-making hormone. Andro, male, gen, genesis. And testosterone is the main androgen, and that's got a couple of, call them family members. Now, what happens in these people is that they have testosterone, and it's like the key that unlocks a door, but their locks don't work. So the receptor for testosterone is faulty or absent, and so therefore they get no effective testosterone. Now, conceptually, there is no basis at all to include that condition in the regulations. So that's a problem. If you then move the needle slightly further to the left or right, whatever, you get a condition called partial androgen insensitivity. So now you can use testosterone, but not in the normal way. The problem you've got now is, how do you decide how much is too much? How partial do you need to be in order to be female versus male? And so now there's a real problem of scientific objectivity and accuracy of diagnosis and understanding that potential advantage. So you could argue that PAIS should be removed from the regulation because it would appear arbitrary as to whether you think the person has enough advantage.
So in the case, I mean, I look at it from an outsider's perspective and not a scientific perspective, but in the case of Caster, it seems that we don't know what her medical pathology is exactly, but we know that she has obviously a DST because that's where we've had this case. But partial seems to be the most likely reason why she is able to do this. In other words, she hasn't developed fully because she has that Y chromosome, but she has developed some characteristics which give her some sort of muscular advantage. I mean, she is a strong person. She's bigger than most women, and she looks obviously slightly more male than a woman would. So, is it a fair thing to say that about her?
I think one has to be careful there that you're not entering a world of almost confirmation bias. There are many athletes who are as muscular who you wouldn't necessarily say that about, and there are many athletes who have one of this set of DSDs who might be as sensitive, but you wouldn't notice. So in both directions, you could have call it a false positive and a false negative. And one of the key legal arguments here is, how do you identify these cases? Do you have to look at them and judge them based on their physical appearance? Because I could give you 5 athletes and ask you which of these has this condition, and I guarantee you it's not 100% accurate.
So one of the interesting paragraphs in the decision by Cass, which says that athletes with 46XY DSD have testosterone levels well into the male range. And then it talks a little bit, goes on to say, and who experience a material androgenizing effect from that enhanced testosterone level to reduce their natural testosterone levels to below 5 nanomoles, whatever. But it's basically what it's saying is that you should be able to see somebody that it has an effect on. And what you're saying is it's almost impossible to actually see that, because I've made the mistake of saying she looks muscular, but actually that might not be the results of testosterone. She could have the same testosterone as somebody who doesn't necessarily look that way, but she just uses it more effectively. And that's really the crux of it, that this weird space about who experience a material androgenizing effect is almost subjective in many ways.
Yeah, so 2 things to that. One is you can simplify a little bit by making it binary.
Trying hard to simplify it. It's difficult.
And the whole issue boils down to the simplification of male versus female. We need binary categories in sport. We need you to compete either in women's events or men's events, but the biology is too complex to be neatly divided in that way, in not many people, but in a small number of people. So on this issue, can the person use testosterone, yes or no? We can ask it like that, and you can say yes, they clearly can, or no, they can't. But that's not really enough. What you should be asking is, how much can they use it? Because you're trying to establish where on a spectrum the advantage might lie. Now, theoretically, the advantage lies between 0% and 12%. 0% in the case that the person has high testosterone. So let's go from the beginning. The person is chromosomally male, XY. They have testes. The testes are producing testosterone. Now, they either can't use all of it, as in they're insensitive, and then there's another medical condition, by the way, called alpha-5 reductase deficiency, where they they can't convert testosterone to something else, and that has knock-on effects. So it's not just how sensitive you are, it's also how you can use it sideways, right? So, you see this person and you say, right, they meet this criteria, this one, this one, this one. Now, can they use the testosterone, yes or no? That person, if they can use it fully, as if they were male, would have a 10 to 12% advantage, theoretically.
Yeah.
If they can't use it at all, it's naught. The problem now is you've got to put somewhere on that line, you've got to drop your pin. And you've got to say the advantage is this. And it matters because if you can't quantify it as a theoretical advantage, then you can't evaluate it against the downsides, the risks, the balance of rights. And that's my biggest objection here, is when we ask the same question of men versus women, men have, without question, a 10 to 12% advantage. So we know what the magnitude is. I would argue that in a DSD athlete, we don't know where, from 0 to 12, that advantage lies. It's definitely there, and I don't want to be under any illusions. Semenya and other athletes like her with those conditions probably have significant advantages, but I don't know how big it is, and so therefore I can't interpret what it means, and I can't justify regulating it.
And that's exactly what you guys brought as Caster's team to the Court of Arbitration, is that this evidence doesn't substantiate this performance benefit, and until such time as they can, you can't regulate it.
Exactly.
Because it's messy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when you said earlier that the IAAF ignore it or gloss over it, there's an important point which some listeners might think is semantic, and I hope I can explain it so that you understand that it's not. If you say Caster Semenya has a biological advantage of 10 to 12% or X% because she has male-like biology, that's a different statement from saying that the theoretical potential advantage for someone like Caster Semenya is 6-7%, right? Because in one of them you're allowing for the person to not get there, in the other one you're saying the advantage is there. Imagine we framed that and said that Mike has a 10 to 12% advantage compared to Kate.
Yeah.
No one would disagree with you. But Mike may have a 10 to 12% advantage compared to Kate. The theoretical difference between
Kate,
Mike
my
and
wife,
Kate,
just in case you don't know.
yes, the theoretical difference between Mike and Kate is 12% due to testosterone. That's a theoretical argument. The problem if you say the difference between Mike and Kate is 12%.
Because there's no proof of that.
Because
Unless you actually take our performances and do a whole series of tests.
there's no proof that you are getting all of that 12%.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that you could. You could, right? So therefore it's more accurate to say you may have a theoretical advantage of 10 to 12%. The problem if you say that Mike has a 10 to 12% advantage over Kate is that you've created what is actually an easily falsifiable theory. Because now all I have to do is go away and find a man who doesn't have a 10% advantage compared to a woman, and I can say, look, this person proves that the advantage is not 10 to 12%. And you'd be astonished how many people do that.
Yeah.
They will go and they will find men who are slower than women, and they'll say, well, this guy's got high testosterone, he's not faster than the woman, therefore testosterone doesn't work. So if you want to be biologically accurate, you have to talk about the theoretical advantage that men enjoy over women is 10 to 12%, and therefore we have to regulate it. You can't pin that theoretical advantage down in a DSD, and that's why you can't regulate it, in my opinion.
So I guess this is an impossible thing to achieve, but if you could find out if some sort of test was done down the line where you could actually figure out how an athlete uses the testosterone available, it is probably if there's any way of doing this a fair way, that's the only fair way to do it, saying you have X amount of testosterone, you use X amount, therefore you have an advantage, an evidence-based advantage rather than just a theoretical one.
Yes, in theory you can do that in the same way that someone who is being diagnosed as diabetic goes for tests and they work out how sensitive you are to the hormone insulin. So it's probably theoretically possible to do that. I don't know how long it'll take to get there. The problem then is, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
Because I guarantee you there'll be an overlap between men and women in that respect. So there will be some women with low testosterone but high effect, and some men with high testosterone, low effect. And when you look at the two populations, there'll be a lot of overlap. So it becomes almost irrelevant as a as a candidate for regulation. The reason testosterone was attractive is because the level of it is theoretically totally distinct between men and women.
Yeah. So let's move on to the gender versus sex debate, and that's the sort of a second part of this decision. We were talking off air about the idea of testosterone levels being this measure. So, for instance, if I was going to decide that for 10 months I was going to take medication that would reduce my testosterone below this 5 nanomoles per litre that the IAAF are proposing, theoretically, could I then line up at the start of a women's race and race it?
You'd be 2 months premature. You said
12,
10 months.
10 months, I thought it was 12.
You need 12 months.
12 months.
And that's covered in a regulation for transgender male to female athletes. So any human being, let's do that again. Any man can reassign or re-identify as a woman and can compete in sport provided they show that their testosterone levels have been under, at the moment 10, it'll probably change to 5 fairly soon, thanks to this decision. And they will then be allowed to compete as women. So the only requirement to compete in women's sport is that you have to declare yourself female. You don't need legally to be recognized as a woman. You just have to self-declare, and you have to lower your testosterone below 10, soon to be 5, for 12 months.
Yeah.
For an athlete with a DSD, the concept is similar. You have to lower your testosterone to below 5, but for 6 months. That's really where these two policies overlap. Where they differ, and that's important, is they apply to completely different populations. But the transgender issue is a big deal. I think it's the next big battleground for sport, and it wouldn't surprise me if the fear of men competing as women has permeated the way we think about Caster Semenya, and that ultimately has swayed this decision, because they're so fearful that an army of men is going to start entering and running as women, and that fear has been bound up into this DSD issue. When I look at world-renowned scientist and lawyer Paula Radcliffe talking in the media about these issues, she keeps talking about transgender men, women, and DSDs in the same sentence. And to me, that conflates the issues unfairly, ignorantly, maliciously, I don't know, but they are separate. But it's all about testosterone.
So let's just define this gender versus sex, because I think that's kind of the nub of the wider discussion around this. So gender is how people identify themselves. So we talk about how many gender identification options there are on Facebook, for instance, something like 70 different ones. Sex is the biology, gender is the identification of yourself. So it's important to recognize the difference between those two terms.
Exactly, and then as pertains to our discussion, we ask, why does sport have men and female categories? Is that a gender differentiation? Do we divide them into genders, or do we divide athletes into biological sex categories?
Yeah, and I think what's key is that we've seen some of the ramblings online with some of the economists. In fact, on a local site here, they talked a bit about her. She grew up as a woman. She is a woman. Therefore, why can't she compete as a woman? So understanding that people say they identify as women, therefore they have to run as women, it is not the science. This is there's such a difference between the sex versus gender debate.
Yeah, there's no doubt that self-identification doesn't work, because men would then be able to self-identify as women without any intervention at all, and women would basically disappear from elite sport if that was allowed to happen. Now, that's the transgender fear. Again, can't stress enough, this is the DSD issue, and because these are different populations, I don't think that the same logic should be applied. So the logic that is applied to regulating men who want to change to become women is fine. And if there was a court case, by the way, in the next few months, where a biological male was arguing that they should be allowed to run in women's sport without alteration, I would be 100% in the side of the IAAF. I would gladly testify on their behalf about how important testosterone is and all these things we spoke about, the theoretical advantage of 10 to 12%. But that's not what this is.
Yeah.
This is an argument about a set of conditions where that person cannot, by definition, use testosterone. Something has not worked. And whatever that thing is, affects the theoretical argument about how much performance benefit they get. If they could use testosterone, they wouldn't exist as a DSD. So the point is they can't use it in a number of different ways. So therefore, we shouldn't talk about them as if they're biological males.
Yeah. So the big question that has been raised in many different platforms and media, particularly in South Africa, and because we're, South Africans get very worked up about this thing because it feels so personal to us, is this about Caster Semenya or about this wider issue? Now, you might say, well, we've talked about this issue, it's not about Caster Semenya, but we alluded it slightly at the start of this conversation, this podcast, talking about the fact that it's aimed at certain events around her, and we've also now got the SEPCO talking about the fact that he was asked if he was going to take the recommendation of CAS in allowing this 1500 meter mile event not to be included in this regulation. Does it feel to you like it's a Caster thing at all?
I can see that it ultimately lands on her shoulders more heavily than on anyone else's, but I don't think it was designed to do that. I think that's the outcome, not its intention. So I think there's a distinction between those two things, and I tried to explain earlier why the events covered just happened to be hers. I think it was because they were bound by a mandate to come back with evidence for the regs, and the only evidence they could find happened to be hers, in part because of her. Because the study they did, by the way, is they went to the world champs and they looked at every female competitor's performance and their testosterone level, and they tried to link those two together. And what they ended up finding is that if you were in the high testosterone group, so in other words, if you were in the top level for testosterone, your performance was better than in the low testosterone group in those specific events. And so they write a paper which basically concludes that there is evidence for an advantage of testosterone in those events.
Yeah.
Another person might have sat down, by the way, and written that same paper with a headline, absence of effective testosterone in 17 out of 22 women's track and field events. Because that's the reality. They found an effect and said, yes, we've succeeded. I looked at that and said, they looked for an event and no, they failed. I remember reading the study and going, is this it? Is this all you've got?
Yeah.
A small effect in 4 or 5 events?
Yeah.
That's not good enough.
And there are some data points which were questionable in this research.
Well, so that comes later. So then a colleague, now a friend of mine in Colorado, sends me an email. He says, listen, he's looking at the stats in this paper, and some of it looks a bit dubious. What do I reckon? He and I request the data, and we have a crack at it ourselves and start looking into it. So we did that. We emailed the authors of that paper. And
this is the IAAF paper that was released last year.
Yeah, and it was, I think it might have been published in 17, but this was the paper that comes directly out of the previous court case decision. Remember that Cass said, numbers matter, find us the evidence. Yep. This paper is that evidence.
Right.
So, and it's not studying DSDs, it's studying women with high versus women with low. So that's quite different. But nevertheless, we get the data and we look at it and we say, this is unbelievable, because in their data set, they've got performances that didn't happen. So for instance, there's a time, let's say 201.32 in the 800, and we're looking in those world championships, that time wasn't run. So that's either a typo, or it's an error, or it's a duplication. I don't know, I can't explain it. We called it a phantom time.
It's quite a serious issue. I mean, so making a typo in something like this is a serious.
And so it wasn't just one typo. We looked at some events. They didn't send us all the data. They sent us some events, and we found that between 17 and 30%, I think it was. Let's to be safe. Let me call it 17 to 20% of their data was actually erroneous. Duplication of times, omission of some athletes' times, phantom times. The bottom line was that we didn't believe that the conclusions from that paper were trustworthy because we didn't think that the data was trustworthy. And so in April, May and June last year, Roger from Colorado, myself, and a Norwegian scientist who is a pretty big researcher outside of sports science, but he got involved. We wrote a paper suggesting, or basically demanding, that scientific study be retracted from publication, which is a big deal. And it was just personally, that was my debate and my involvement there is what got me into the Caster Semenya's defence for Cass.
Because to some extent, when the debate around Caster Semenya started, you were almost on the side of the IAAF in terms of protecting women's thought. But this change and this evidence has led you to almost change your mind about the evidence that is available.
About the evidence. So for me, I see the separation between theory and evidence.
Yeah.
And I stand by the theory of the advantage.
And you're an evidence guy, we know this.
Yeah, I'm trying to be. I mean, of course, we all have biases and so forth. And I remember watching and writing articles about Semenya saying that I'm fully on the side of the IAAF, these athletes should be banned and so forth. And the watershed for me was looking at that evidence. As I said, I looked at it and I was like, I can't, is this all you got?
Yeah.
Surely there's more. And then when the regulation comes out and it only covers some events, that makes it, in my opinion, significantly weaker than it used to cover.
And makes people get emotional about the fact that it seems aimed at one person.
Yeah, so now it looks arbitrary, it looks targeted, it looks twice as discriminatory as it did before, because before it was at least applied to all women, now it's applied to some women. And then you're going to say, well, on what basis? And that's where it falls short. So that the evidence was a massive watershed. The struggles we had, by the way, getting that data, and we wrote in our paper how difficult it was to get that data, and we criticized the lack of transparency around this, because you see, for good governance there has to be transparency, and this is universally a problem in sport. You think about anti-doping as well, the transparency is appalling, whereas and similarly in this issue, we tried to get the data, we really struggled to get that data, and eventually we concluded that this study, which really does underpin the regulations, was so flawed that it should have been retracted, and therefore the regulations shouldn't stand.
One of the interesting points in this decision by CAS was they talk about the difficulties of implementation of the DST regulations. So we talked right at the start of this podcast about this sort of slightly schizophrenic nature of this decision, because yes, they're saying we want to protect the sport, the IAAF has brought enough evidence for us to be satisfied, but how are you going to implement this in a way that is fair and actually does not only protect the sport itself, but also the athletes that are potentially in harm's way?
Exactly. So one of the, we spoke a little earlier about the allegation that the policy is racist. And I reject as a concept that the IAAF are racist to try and do this. I don't believe they're targeting a particular racial group. However, on the implementation side, when you actually deliver the regulation, there is considerable potential for it to look and potentially be racist. And that's because you have to identify these cases based on physical appearance.
Yeah.
So there's a real possibility there of subjective judgment, which can be racially biased. And then the reality is that this policy will affect athletes who are African more than it will affect them from the rest of the world, because there's good reason to believe that these medical conditions are more common, more prevalent in Africa. So on those grounds, I can see real issues for human rights and racism and discrimination once you start actually doing it. I still, to reiterate, I still reject that it's racist as a concept, but I can see why people feel aggrieved on the other side of it.
So the last couple of days we've seen the World Medical Association come out in a very I wouldn't say controversial, but a very clear directive about doctors now have to potentially give this medication to athletes like Caster Semenya. Ross, just tell us a bit about that decision, and we're going to be playing an interview very shortly with somebody you spoke to who can give us a bit more clarity on where doctors sit in this big space.
Yeah, so this issue relates to once the athlete is identified as having a DSD and has to lower their testosterone, they've got to go through one of three medical processes. One of those is surgery to remove the internal testes. If you do that, obviously testosterone all but disappears. The second option is you can have an injection of a drug that blocks your testosterone production. And the third option is that you can take oral contraceptives to lower your testosterone levels. Now, those two medical options in particular are crucial to understanding the case. And this was, I spoke earlier about my first watershed was the data. My second watershed was understanding a little bit about the medical risks, because the use of these drugs presents with risks. Any woman who's ever taken the pill or oral contraceptives will tell you that sometimes the side effects are a little bit unpleasant. In this instance, you might have to take much higher dosages, and you might have to take them permanently for years and years and years. You can't stop, because if you stop and your testosterone level goes back up, then you're ineligible. So the policy basically compels these people to take high dose for a reason that the drug is not intended. So that's called off-label use. And what the World Medical Association came out and said is that they believe that to be medically unethical. And they in fact encourage their doctors to not implement this policy. And that was a couple of weeks ago. And then yesterday afternoon, I saw again a similar statement, and I just want to try and read that to you so that I get it right. They say the World Medical Association has reiterated its advice to physicians around the world to take no part in implementing new eligibility regulations for classifying female athletes. Now, that's potentially massive, because if the World Medical Association says that, and the signatories to the World Medical Association, which would be, for instance, the South African Medical Association and others around the world, comply with that, then doctors who are covered and registered with those organizations are potentially contravening ethics in order to obey the policy. And that's got massive implications for insurance, for medical ethics, for legal considerations, potentially criminal charges if something goes wrong. And so it bottom line is it means that the policy might be impossible to actually implement because doctors won't do it.
I was going to actually just pause there for a second. I'll add this in. What is the guy's name?
Mark Blockman.
Mark Blockman.
Professor Mark Blockman.
And he's from the South African?
He's from the University of Cape Town, and he's the head of its ethics committee. How do you feel it's going so far? Good, huh?
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Mark Blockman, B-L-O-C-K. And he's from the?
University of Cape Town.
Yeah.
Let me get his exact affiliation for you here.
Because I'll chop all this bit out now, and then I'll introduce him.
Blockers. So he's the chair of the Human Research Ethics Committee at UCT.
Human Research Ethics Committee, okay.
He's a clinical pharmacologist.
I think that's fine, just that's cool.
So it's Professor Mark Blockman.
University of Cape Town, the chair of the Human Research Ethics Committee.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll do that.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to count it. I'm going to play the interview in 3, 2, 1. So that was Professor Mark Blockman, the University of Cape Town, the chairman of the Human Research Ethics Committee, and it just shows the impact of this on the doctors, because essentially what he's saying, if you go down this road of actually helping athletes helping them, but giving athletes medication that's off-label, there's a lot of repercussions involved.
Yeah, so the fundamental issue here is that there is no medical precedent or protocol for what is done to these athletes. And the bottom line then is that you're taking a healthy person, an elite, healthy athlete, and you're turning them into patients. And you don't know whether the policy works, whether the medical intervention works. You don't know whether it's safe or not. It's never been studied. So there are no standardized medical protocols which will then influence what is off-label use of potentially harmful drugs. Now, it's important there that you heard his voice and not mine, because I'm not in the business of prescribing drugs, whereas he is.
Yeah.
And he has a better understanding of the medical ethics than I would. But their voice, those doctors, to me, seems extremely significant. And I noted again that CAS recognized that in its decision. So they mention at one point in their decision that there are issues that may arise in the future. I think it's the third of the 3 points they say, which goes towards the proportionality here of the intervention. But they don't seem to weight it as much as certainly I do, and as much as someone like Professor Mark Blockman did there.
Says the side effects of hormonal treatment, this is point 3, the side effects of hormonal treatment experienced by individual athletes could, with further evidence, demonstrate the practical impossibility of compliance, which could in turn lead to a different conclusion. Is that kind of what they're saying, that it's difficult when they take these medications? And as you've said previously, taking this medication doesn't necessarily guarantee that they are going to become better or worse athletes, because as we've already found out in this podcast, testosterone is not the actual conclusion of this, and even if they take this medication, the side effects of the medication could be the reason for the lack of performance, not the testosterone directly.
Yeah, exactly. So what's going to happen almost invariably here is that any athlete who lowers their testosterone will get worse, right?
Yeah.
Because testosterone is so important to the biology of performance. It increases muscle mass, so now Caster Semenya's muscle mass goes down. It reduces fat mass, and now the fat mass will go up. It's responsible for hemoglobin, so now the hemoglobin levels come down. Those 3 things alone will impact performance negatively.
Yeah.
The problem is that, let's say for argument's sake, Caster Semenya gets 4 to 5% slower. It's still quite difficult to quantify why she slowed down. Is it the direct effect of having less testosterone, or is it the effect caused by the drug that she's taking to lower the testosterone? So you don't know whether it's indirect or direct, and it's also difficult to control because her body, over the course of 28 years, has a set point for how much it needs, and now you're denying it what's normal for her system. So the situation is complex. I suspect that all these athletes will slow down.
Yeah.
The IAAF will say, look, that validates our policy, because if they all slow down by 5 to 7%, the IAAF will say, well, that's how big the advantage was, we were quite right.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's entirely true, but even if it is, there's still a medical issue around whether you can justify the potential risks based on this advantage.
So just taking a little step back, the World Medical Association directive, am I right in saying that one of the big issues here is that even if Caster is going to take this medication, decides to take the medication, potentially there is nobody to administer this medication?
Right, because any doctor who wants to be compliant with the ethical guidelines set out, as advised in this instance by that association, as agreed to by the South African Medical Association, would say, Caster, I can't in good conscience, having sworn an oath to look after your health and your beneficence and your well-being, I can't do this. Because what if something goes wrong? And the things that can go wrong are drastic. I mean, you can cause severe osteoporosis potentially. You can cause, these drugs can cause thrombolytic events, basically clots, which can be fatal. And just on that, athletes are already at significantly increased risk for clots. People who fly are at significantly increased risks for clots. And so the combination of those 2 things, plus this, the point is, the risk might be 1 in 500, it might be 1 in 5,000, I don't know. But it's a risk that need not exist, because these are not unhealthy people. They're healthy athletes who are being made into patients by regulation. And the counter argument to this is, well, we have to do it, we can't always know exactly what's going to happen. You can't run a human biological experiment as part of a sports governance policy.
Last time we did human experiments on people, it didn't end well. I mean, it is.
Well,
We remind ourselves a little bit of this because it is kind of an experiment of humans, and again with untested drug use and
Again, don't take my word for it. You heard it from the medical ethical expert there, Prof. Blockman. That's exactly what this is. It's in the absence of these protocols, dosages, safety, side effects. This is experimental with risk of harm, and I don't believe enough benefit. You haven't shown the upside, And so when Cass says it's discriminatory, fine. Key point there is you can have something discriminatory, but it has to be reasonable, necessary, and proportional. I don't think it's necessary because of the lack of evidence, and I certainly don't think it's proportional because of what we've been discussing now.
So I suppose the question when it comes to Caster Semenya, I'm not asking you to put some conjecture on this, but she's up against it. She's in a catch-22 position. She potentially can't take medication, or she has to move up to events which are not suitable to her. I mean, she might be a bit competitive in the 5,000 meters, as we saw at the South African Championships a couple of weeks ago. She beat a very good athlete in Dominic Scott. But is there a way? Is that the end of Caster Semenya's career, do you think? I know you hate thinking about these things, but your hypothesis, is it a no-win situation for her?
I don't hate thinking. I love thinking about these things because it's a cool opinion and it's cool to hypothesize. And there's so many, by the way. Purely, if we could remove ourselves from discussing it as involved, it would be unbelievably fascinating over the next while to look at what happens. You know, if she runs the 5,000 and she can be she can succeed enough to go to the diamond leagues and so forth. Maybe once in a while in a slower tactical race she can win some titles and medals. I don't know. I'd be very surprised if she's anything like as world class and dominant there as she is on the 800. It would be actually borderline unprecedented to be as dominant over that spectrum of events. You know, the 400, 800 is physiologically quite different to the 5. And when you look at the top East Africans now running in the low 14s, sub 14:30, I don't know that Caster Semenya will get down there, but maybe she'll prove me wrong. So, as a 5,000 meter runner, I suspect she'll be very good, but not great. I guess she would have been hoping that the IAAF took up the court's decision to take the 1,500 off, but Sebastian Coe certainly put an end to that one.
Well, that was happening just, in fact, it was, I think, in the newspapers this morning. Sebastian Coe asked whether he was going to take this regulation, and his answer was not very complicated. He just said no.
Yes.
Quite a cold response to something that was, something very emotional for lots of people.
Yeah, but of course, if you're Sebastian Coe or the IAAF and someone asks, Lord Coe, would you consider taking the 1,500 off because there's no evidence? You're not going to discuss that because there's no evidence.
Yeah.
So it undermines your position because you've implemented a policy that's weak in the absence of evidence, but you're going to tell the world you've got evidence.
Yeah.
So he's caught in a classic bind there because he can't explain it, so of course he's got one word. and the thing is, those people would have sat down at some point and said, right, we're going to add the 15 a year ago.
Yeah.
And they didn't add that thing arbitrarily. They did it for a very good reason. And so when Cass makes a polite suggestion to please change it, given that Cass has no authority over them to force them to change it, they'll say, ha ha, thanks, no.
Not much goodwill, I sense, in that respect. I mean, I'm being a bit harsh on the IAAF and to suggest that if they did say, okay, we actually take your point, there's not enough evidence here, let's make the 1,500 mile not part of these regulations.
No, there's no desire to compromise. And that's...
it weakens their position in some respect.
It does, because it's a confession that you don't have evidence. And if you don't have evidence in the 8, then in my opinion it puts if you don't have the evidence in the 1,500, then it puts the 800, the 400 back into the spotlight. And you can say, well, how's your evidence there? Not very good. Yeah. But let's they'd rather shut that conversation down super fast. And the problem, the thing is, they are utterly convinced of the merits of their argument. They believe this to be so necessary to protect women's sport that they are uncompromising in their intent, which, in other circumstances you would say is noble. Steadfast in principle, that's what they're being. It's just their principle is on a flimsy foundation, in my opinion.
So I suppose the final question is, what is the future of this debate? Is it over? Is there lots more still to come? Is there a solution to this issue?
Well, it seems it'll rage on and on, certainly in South Africa. The rest of the world will move on quicker than we will, because I think we've got more invested in it, obviously. If she goes the legal route, then it goes on a lot longer. I don't know enough about what that involves, other than to speculate that it probably involves a lot of time, and it might involve a lot of money, and a lot of energy, and potentially a different set of arguments, because I'm not sure that the next step on appeal revisits the same set of evidence. Of course, they're all germane and relevant all the time, but it might go more in a human rights... If you go to the European Human Rights Court, they're not going to be as interested in the nuance of testosterone in men versus women, So that's an area where it might change the legal focus a little bit. If she doesn't go for the appeal and she keeps running, does she stay at the same event and slow down? How much? There's certainly be interesting things to discuss around this issue in the future. If this medical issue that we've been discussing, and this World Medical Association, and what we heard from Mark Blockman, if that gathers enough momentum, that threatens to potentially blow this thing in another legal direction.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's what comes next. But, I mean, it's been 10 years, why would it end now?
Theoretical solutions, are there any?
If I was king or judge for a day, I would have said, look, I get your concept and I'm still sympathetic. As the IAAF, you do have an obligation to ensure fairness, but you haven't met the standards necessary. Your science isn't robust and of a high enough quality. So I'm going to give you a little bit more time, but I'm going to give you 3 to 5 years because I don't want you to come back here with bad science. So if it's going to take you 5 years, you take 5 years.
Yeah.
But the key point here is you can't do it yourself. You can't ask the IAAF to gather research to support its own policy when the IAAF has shown that it is absolutely steadfast in its belief. Because you're asking them to confirm their own bias. It's like asking a cigarette company to do research to show that cigarettes are safe. What do you think they're going to do? So whatever research
you can
is
twist
done,
research any way you want, really. Even good research can be twisted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it wouldn't be the first time that I don't want to say corrupt, but conflicted research has changed what we think to be true. So I think that the court should have said, look, you've got 5 years, but you've got to get independent research done. Now, the research is hell of a difficult. I'm not going to pretend that it's easy because you're trying to answer the unanswerable. Because how do you compare Caster Semenya with high testosterone to Caster without? She doesn't exist as that person unless you medicate, but then as we've seen, the medicines might have such severe side effects. So it's a super tough study to do. But I would say you've got to do it independently. You've got to put together a steering group of people who are independent of the IAAF, and you've got 5 years to come back here to disprove that DSDs have an advantage. And then we can talk again. Until that time, you let people compete where they identify unless they change. So, if someone is born male and decides later in life to run as a woman, then you can intervene. Then you can now have them reduce their testosterone. But if someone's born a girl and I hate to use this word because it sounds so relativistic, if someone is enough of a girl to be raised by her family and a community as a girl, and she becomes a woman and an adult woman, I don't think you can tell that person that they were wrong.
Yeah.
And so therefore they stay where they were born unless they change. Then you can intervene. Yeah. That's what my alternative solution would be until the evidence becomes so strong. What evidence, I've thought about this a lot in the last 2 months, what evidence would be strong enough? If a woman one day got the full benefits of testosterone, one day we will see a woman running 145 for an 800.
Yeah. And
then everyone will go, wow, now it's obvious. Now we know that we have to do something here. But until that time, when we look at Caster Semenya, she's dominant. But Caster Semenya's average margin of victory is 1%.
Yeah.
The biggest margin of victory that Semenya has achieved in a Diamond League or a World or an Olympic race is 2.1%. So she's only getting a 2% advantage, where in theory she could have had a 10 to 12. Does that mean that she's just actually a lesser athlete with the benefit? I don't know, but you can't convince me of that. Until you can, you've got to leave it the way it is.
That's a great summary, particularly that last thing you just said. It is interesting that she is not competing with men. She is still just better than women and nowhere near those male standards. Professor Rostaker, it's been a fascinating discussion, our third podcast in our series Science of Sport. Don't forget you can interact with us on Twitter, Science Sports Sci Pod, Sports, and then SCI Pod. Also, Ross is on Science of Sport, and my handle on Twitter is Mike Finch SA. You can interact with us, let us know what you think about a podcast. We're always interested to investigate subjects that you're interested in, and of course this debate I suspect will go on for a long, long time, and it probably won't be the first time we will do this podcast. Ross, thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you next time.
As always, can't wait for the next one. was great. The only thing we didn't cover, I don't know if we can insert it in one of your gaps, is why is this not the same as long arms and big feet? A lot of people are saying that. A lot of people are saying you're trying to regulate this one but not others, and that's stupid.
I'm trying to think I can insert that. Sure, we didn't do that. Let's record it anyway and let's see.
Yeah, maybe there's a slot, because you did give me 3 or 4 slots where we've got a pause.
We can come out between, we can actually do one in between, which is just going to make it a separate track. Hang on a minute. I thought that was absolutely excellent, to be honest with you. I felt like we ordered, we covered everything except for that. Yeah. But I think I knew where we were and it was
good, yeah. I don't know if I did that bit where I was explaining the difference between having an advantage and having a potential advantage. Does that make sense to you?
See, that's the first.
Okay.
That discussion we've had now. Yeah. I feel like we've distilled it down really well. Like I'm getting it. And it's
because that's one of the things. If the IAAF had lost, that would have been my first reason why.
Yeah.
Is because they didn't frame it correctly. They said that athletes have an advantage. They should have said could have an advantage.
Yeah.
And I didn't. Anyway, so I'm glad, because in my mind I didn't explain that as well as I wrote it yesterday. I wrote it down yesterday and I was like, this is great, and I kind of botched it now. But if we can insert that little bit about, there's been lots of people talking about Michael Phelps and his lactate and his long arms and Usain Bolt's long legs and his fast twitch fibers. Why are those arguments not correct or admissible in this case?
Let me just quickly, I'm just going to set up this one. You are on one. You are on two. I just have this noise up. I've got a massive sign saying please be quiet, I can hear people outside. Testing one. Give me a sound balance quickly. You want to say my name is Ross Tucker?
Yeah, my name's Ross Tucker and we are doing take 2.
This is just I'll intro into it. Okay. So one of the critical debates, I guess, criticisms of these decisions and this issue around the advantage of testosterone and all the benefits you mentioned already is that how is this different from Michael Phelps having big feet and basketball players being tall? Is it not just a physical advantage that she has over other athletes?
Yeah, I've seen this argument for years. Since 2009, people say sport is all about genetic advantages. How can you take away one person's, but you're not worried about Phelps's long arms, big feet, low lactate, tall players in basketball? I understand what those people are getting at, but I don't think that it's a relevant argument for a couple of reasons. One is that we don't have a category in swimming for small feet. We don't have a category in swimming for short arms. We don't have a basketball competition for short people who are disadvantaged. Obviously they are. We all agree that height matters in basketball. So why don't we protect short basketball players? Why don't we say that if you're 175 or shorter, you need quote unquote performance protection, so here's your separate category. Now, to some extent that is arbitrary, but the creation of women's sport separate from men's sport is not arbitrary, it's biological and necessary because the difference between men and women is so enormous that without separation women would disappear. Now, what that means is that women's sport exists as a protected category. And if you have a line separating one group from another and that group needs protection in terms of its performances, you have to kind of defend that line. Because we don't have a line for short arms and small feet and short people, it's actually irrelevant whether Phelps's arms could be so long that he could tie his shoelaces without bending down. It wouldn't matter because there's no category to protect the guy who can't, right? So it's actually an irrelevant argument. It's a non-starter in that respect. The other reason it's different is because when we look at testosterone and performance, and so many people get this messed up, in my opinion, they'll look at athletes with low testosterone who are better than athletes with high testosterone, and they'll say, oh, that shows that it's not all about testosterone. Nobody's pretending that it's all about testosterone. What we are saying is that testosterone is necessary to compete at the highest human levels that males reach. If you don't have testosterone and its effects, you cannot be an elite male athlete?
Because testosterone at upper levels and taken illegally is illegal.
Well, that's why it's on the list of doping, is because it has such powerful effects on performance that we've decided to stop people using it artificially.
Yeah.
So testosterone is necessary, but not sufficient. In other words, you and I have it, but we're nowhere near elite athletes in any sport, right? So it's like you should think about testosterone as the thing that gets you through the door, but once you're in the room, now all the other stuff matters. So VO2 max is the amount of oxygen a runner can use. It's a function of their cardiovascular system and their muscles and how much oxygen they can take in and use. If you looked at VO2 max across the world's population, elite athletes have a much higher VO2 max than non-elite athletes. But if you looked at VO2 max in all the people who ran the London Marathon elite race last weekend, the difference between Eliud Kipchoge and the guy who comes 10th might be non-existent, because other factors matter once you look at a narrow population. Does that make sense? So in other words, once you're an elite athlete, you already have a high VO2 max, and so now other things start to play a role. It's the same in basketball. If you looked at the height of NBA players, it doesn't predict performance. But that's because everyone is tall. It's the top 1% of people in terms of height. So therefore, the effect, the variable you're looking for's effect disappears because it's already present in every single person. Right? So that's a really important concept. Now, having low testosterone in this instance is the disadvantage. Having small feet is the disadvantage. Having short arms is the disadvantage. Point one is we don't regulate the arms and the feet. But point two is that all things being equal, having short arms or small feet, you're not going to come 4,000th in the world. You know, in other words, the effect that having the disadvantage makes is not that big. I guarantee you, having no testosterone, or benefits of testosterone like women don't, that's worth thousands and thousands of places in the world. So the best women are in the thousands in the world rankings because of the absence of that. So conceptually, theoretically, qualitatively, it's different. And by the numbers, testosterone is much more powerful than having long arms or big feet.
I guess one of the best examples of that is the Paralympics, because in many ways they are protecting segments. So for instance, in the cerebral palsy division, there'll be 4 or 5 divisions of the severity of cerebral palsy in a division. So there is precedence for protecting segments of the athletic population. That's obviously a very specific one.
Paralympics is the best example because you get different severities, therefore different negative impacts on performance. And what we've decided is we're going to divide cerebral palsy into 3 categories for, let's say, for running: T36, 37, 38. The problem is it's very difficult to tell them apart. You know, the difference between a 37 and a 38 is sometimes quite subtle, and you'll get someone who's less affected running down or more affected running up. So that causes controversy. So it's the most similar. But the point is, if you're protecting someone who has disadvantages, you have to figure out how you do it. We don't protect people with small feet and short arms, so that it's irrelevant.
Yeah. Perfect.
Cool.
That's a nice little one. I'll probably put that in after. There's a nice little segue we can show in there. Nice little spot. It's some great, there's some blooming marvelous voice little snippets. That was great. I'm really happy with that.
Yeah, that was cool. I think I laboured some of the answers.
Nah, I think you. I don't think you did badly there. I think it was very tight. It's going to be. It's probably the hardest one we're ever going to do, purely because it's so complex.
funny thing I didn't get in. We don't have to get it in. Was the credits fee liver thing? You know, everyone's like, no one asks questions about her. I'm like, are you kidding me? She's like the least trustworthy performance in history. Anyways. Phone call at Chris Barron from the Sunday Times now. He wants to do his, he does his normal thing. Are you here for a while or shall I leave?